You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 494 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about Trump firing an inspector general who was looking into Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. I have updates for some pretty significant events going on in Afghanistan, and there's a really good new article out by Gareth debunking the myth that Iran supported Al-Qaeda. All right, everybody, I need you to share the show. You find it online at the Libertarian Institute, where I am the news editor and write the daily news roundup. Both the show and the roundup could be found on the homepage, libertarianinstitute.org. If you're a new listener to the show, make sure you subscribe to it somewhere. Giving the show likes, ratings, reviews will help the show to get noticed, so I appreciate it when everybody could take the time to do those things. And then last, you could donate to the show at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. A couple interesting stories here going on at home. The police officer, or at least one of them, who hid during the Parkland shooting has been rehired and actually gets to return to the same rank and status as before, and I believe gets back pay for all the time that he's been laid off since the shooting. You know, typically, if I'm going to be talking about the police union getting an officer's job back and it being absolutely absurd, it's because an officer used inappropriate amount of violence in a situation that didn't require it, was rightfully fired for assaulting or at times even murdering, raping people, and then the police union will go to work for them and they end up getting their job back. But in this case, it's actually just a police officer who's a proven coward, who obviously cannot do the job. If, you know, we live in our society and culture right now where police are the people that are giving guns in school zones to protect children. Nobody else could really do that, because if you do, you get arrested and charged, I believe, with a felony. So, you know, these are the people that are, and then the school is attacked, and this is one of the people who cowardly hid. I don't think it's the, school resource officer who actually hid behind the building, but somebody who waited in his car while the school was attacked. Some more coverage of the coronavirus crackdown. We now have Michigan suspending the license of a barber who remained open during the pandemic here. A couple things. If you look at the picture of the barber, this is elderly man is the right word, but he is in advanced state. You know, he's well past the midpoint of his life, and that seems to put him, and again, this is just judging by a picture, but the assumptions that you can make, it would put him in a higher risk factor, among the population that's more likely to die of coronavirus. And so if he's making the choice that I need to be able to work more than I need to be able to avoid getting COVID, because that's what's most important to my life, then, at that point, I think the state should really start to consider if these lockdowns are the right move. And unfortunately, we're really not seeing that anywhere. Very few of these public officials have been able to really look in the mirror and say, like, hey, maybe this was a step too far. Maybe this was a better decision. But no, everything they did was right and everything they did saved us. So one of the disturbing things about this is, as tragic as the story talked about, the woman in Texas who was put in jail, or I believe was sentenced to jail for 7 days. The Texas Supreme Court, I believe, ruled to keep that from the initial sentences from actually being carried out. But, unlike her, who was fined thousands of dollars, there's another woman in Oregon or Washington State who opened her salon against lockdown orders and was fined tens of thousands of dollars. But this guy seems to be losing his income really in perpetuity as they're suspending his license, and then he'll no longer legally allowed to be a barber until that's returned. This is, at least, if you really think about it, kind of getting close to the social credit system that they, have in China, or that you would talk about in a communist country, where in order to be able to practice your business, you have to be able to follow the, specific rules and dictates of the state. Even if they completely change your life and come without a moment's notice, you're not allowed to question them, or else you can't continue to do your business. And, it's potentially not even just you have to close your business for now. It means you have to close your business forever. Some of the other things that states are doing to prevent businesses from opening are disgusting and absurd. And a lot of people don't realize, I think, how critical it is to have your business open for some people. And you think, well, your business is a salon, so you should really be closed. But as I've talked about on the show in the past, there are people who are choosing between feeding themselves and their children right now because they're put out of work with the coronavirus. Some of these people are in positions where they're a different kind of employee, so they don't really qualify for benefits, or if they do, they don't understand it. The lines for benefits are way backed up. The government's incompetent. We all know that. And so a lot of people who maybe need this are just struggling with the bureaucracy of the welfare state that I've had some experience with it myself is absolutely incompetent and unbelievable in all the, mistakes and just lackadaisical effort and, really phoning it in on their behalf, which I guess is probably what everybody's doing right now, making everything more difficult to get all the people who need this welfare because the state is literally preventing them from going out and earning an income. Last Corona news story I have actually ties into the DoD here, as they are looking to get a bailout for a company that is building some kind of space vehicle for the Space Force. It seems like this should be a very clear example, and this should be the time that we realize that those kind of things, building starships to go blow up Russia or China or to fight battles in space, is so completely absurd and unnecessary. If we really, which apparently didn't happen, but if we really were critically short on ICU beds and doctors and ventilators and medical equipment, and we were, short on PPEs and stuff like that. If we really needed all these other things, it could have all been money taken from the military industrial complex, not spent $6 trillion on all these wasteful wars in the past 20 years. And so we should be calling into question spending on these projects rather than throwing more money at them. Unfortunately, Congress gets so much money from the military industrial complex that actually at times like this, I think the opposite thing happens, where Congress is throwing a lot of money around. People are more tied up in the actual numbers of coronavirus than, every last thing in a $3 or $4 trillion bailout bill. And Congress receives so much money and support from the weapons makers, and they're so key to their reelection, that it's a prime opportunity to throw your favorite donor an easy bone in the bill. And so more and more of this spending gets passed that isn't beneficial at all to the American people in the midst of this crisis. That really should, be a wake-up call to reorient our spending in a more productive way. So I think this is a story that could potentially really catch on if the media pays attention to it and cares to make it a big deal. And that is, it looks like the Inspector General who for the State Department, who was fired by Trump, and several inspector generals were fired by Trump. And initially, I wasn't sure about how important of a story that was. It's obviously interesting that he's firing inspector generals, but at the same time, if people have looked at the Russiagate thing as much as I have and understand how the deep state and Obama era officials operated against Trump during the first 3 years of his campaign or his presidency, well, it would make sense that he would be concerned that these bureaucrats could, stir up some kind of trouble and nonsense against him coming up to the election. And so I don't know if it was immediately a huge concern that these inspector generals were fired, but when they are fired, it is important to look at, whatever they've been up to lately and see like, hey, is the president maybe shutting down an investigation? It seems the one place that this may be a bigger state scandal is with the State Department, where there are, I guess, 2 claims against Mike Pompeo. Unfortunately, I think the one that's getting a little bit more attention at this point is apparently he used some State Department officials as an errand boy, which he shouldn't have done for whatever legal reasons, and it may be against the law and it's probably inappropriate. But at the same time, compared to the, other crimes of Mike Pompeo himself, this is absolutely nothing. I guess I'm happy if it makes him no longer Secretary of State, but these trivial matters that end up actually getting people fired versus the very real, macro foreign policy initiatives, sanctions, wars that these people start giving little attention. And so, again, while, I support Michael Flynn being fired, I support Mike Pompeo being fired, but if it's for a fake scandal, then I think it in some ways is a little bit counterproductive. Now, the other thing that I think is a bigger deal and I hope catches on and people really look into this and start digging into it, because with some recent New York Times reporting on Yemen that I talked about on Friday's show, and I'll tie that all in here, it could be a little bit of an insight into how these weapon sales are going down in the Trump administration. So what the Inspector General was apparently looking into is Pompeo's decision to continue to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia, because that has to be approved by the State Department over a fairly clear objection from Congress. There's been several votes now, at least 4, maybe several more, at least in the Senate alone, but in both houses of Congress now, that attempt to block weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. And there's a number of reasons. The main one is the war in Yemen. But when Mohammed bin Salman likely had Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi murdered and assassinated and dismembered in the Saudi consulate in Turkey, that was another really big step that called a lot of congressmen to take steps to try to block weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. The White House has kind of come up with this pretty, I don't know if it's a lie necessarily, but easily debunked narrative that we're doing this for the jobs, that Saudi Arabia isn't doing great things with all the weapons that we sell them, but they're going to do it anyways, and so if we sell them to them, at least we're creating jobs in the United. So I mean, morally that argument is absolutely atrocious. You're willing to aid a genocide in Yemen just to add some jobs to your payroll, but apparently it doesn't even add that many jobs. I believe it's William Hartung who's done the vast bulk of this work, but he's basically explained that while they claim it's hundreds of thousands of jobs created here, that the number is actually in the very, very small tens of thousands. It's not benefiting that many people. Something I believe that was written in a recent Dub Bandow article was he just points out is how many of these jobs are even in manufacturing. If these jobs are just going towards former congressmen and generals to become lobbyists for the Defense Department, to get a corporate account to go take your former buddies out for a dinner and a round of golf and to chat them up about your company's latest and greatest missile. That way you guys get the missile to sell the Saudi the contracts. That's, I think, a lot of what's going on here, and that's where a lot of the jobs are. The other kind of thing that the Trump administration, the Obama administration really went for this too, because they sold a lot of weapons to Saudi Arabia and support the war in Yemen as well, is that if China is selling these weapons, there's going to be no oversight on them whatsoever, and they'll just slaughter Yemeni civilians indiscriminately. And if we sell it to them, we could kind of limit what they're doing, which I don't think is exactly true and would play out like that. But the Saudis are pretty much doing whatever they want with their weapons as is. A recent story that I talked about, I believe, on Monday's show with Will from the New York Times details how U.S. bombs and bomb fragments have been found at the scenes of, massacres of funerals, weddings, school buses in Yemen. Not to be too pessimistic, but my guess is this doesn't go a very long way politically, in part because it would target and maybe limit how much weapon sales are going on, would look, into a lot maybe of those gory details of the, kind of backroom discussions that go into making those weapons deals happen. So I'm guessing there's going to be a lot of people not interested in talking about it. That being said, it may be a clear-cut case of corruption in the Trump administration, and you do know how much a lot of people in the U.S. do hate Trump. So maybe there will be the motive to go after Pompeo. For a long time seems to be one of Trump's absolute top advisors, especially when it comes to foreign policy, and wrap up the administration a pretty serious scandal. Trump has given the WHO, that's the World Health Organization, 30 days to make some changes, or he is planning on freezing, I guess, all U.S. funding to the WHO. I've kind of talked about this in the past on the show. I have a little bit of conflict as a libertarian. In one sense, funding millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars to these multinational organizations, American taxpayer funded money, is definitely something I oppose, and I'm fine with pulling the plug on the WHO. That being said, we are in the middle of a pandemic here, and for political reasons and funding reasons and just kind of how the international order works right now, the WHO is one of the only organizations that could actually buy and then send coronavirus test kits into places like Yemen and Gaza, and they're desperately needed supplies right now. So for that reason, it may not be a great idea to pull the plug on the WHO right at this moment, especially because when these things happen, apparently the things that get targeted are the actual effective, productive things that these groups do. There are certainly condemnable things that the WHO has done since the start of this pandemic. Looking at, me and Will Porter talked about on the past in this show, going along with some of the narratives from the Chinese government too long, especially if this thing can be transmitted person to person. And then as well, letting China play politics here with Taiwan and trying to exclude Taiwan from some meetings and stuff like that going on because China says, Taiwan can't be its own independent voice in the WHO when, at a time like this, it seems like pretty petty politics to play. Trump and Vladimir Putin have talked recently, and part of that talk was about arms control. About a week or two after that, we have a report from Russia saying they do not believe the U.S. is interested in extending the New START treaty. This is one of those campaign points I'm kind of surprised the Democrats haven't put up. You have the New START treaty, which I believe will expire in January or February of next year, so early next year, but after the election, after the new president will take office, and so they could run on, if we get elected, we're going to expand this thing. I believe there's a very easy way for both countries to extend it just for 5 years, but they could run on actually doing a little bit more and expanding the treaty. And I think they could, kind of paint a doomsday scenario. The U.S. and China, or U.S. and Russia particularly, enter into a new nuclear arms race. And, this costs a lot of money. You have the reckless Donald Trump at the helm. It doesn't fit well into the Russiagate narrative, but at the same time, I think it fits well into the Trump is a dangerous buffoon idea that they have instilled so well in their followers, that maybe they could, make that story play and not just kind of go along with, as Joe Biden is looking at Trump on China, you're too weak on China, not rather than saying, we're going to find ways to get along with the country. So on Afghanistan, I think the most interesting thing that I saw in the past couple of weeks is a tweet by Donald Trump. The Wall Street Journal ran a story saying that Donald Trump is trying to act impulsively and pull U.S. troops out of Afghanistan. Trump very astutely says we've been there for 19 years. At this point, nothing you do there is impulsive. It's time to come home. We had the coronavirus outbreak going on. This is something I've heard reported several times in the past few weeks, that with the COVID outbreak, Trump is really wanting to get U.S. troops out of Afghanistan. The U.S. envoy to Afghanistan is traveling to the country to meet with the Afghan government and the Taliban officials. Apparently, the hope is to pressure these two sides into taking more steps towards talks. There is one reason to think that this might be a little bit more productive, and that is the two men claiming to be president of Afghanistan, the, I guess, more internationally recognized Ashraf Ghani, and the person who, according to the official results, came in second place in the most recent election, Abdullah, have finally come to some kind of power sharing deal. I don't have all the details of the agreement yet, but I understand that Abdullah will be leading the negotiations with the Taliban, or somebody from his party will. And this also includes a promotion to the rank of marshal for a longtime Afghani warlord Dostum, famous for sodomizing people with the barrel of a rifle. The Pentagon reports it's continuing to work on its drawdown laid out in the quote-unquote peace agreement with the Taliban. That does seem to be accurate, and the U.S. Should be down to the 8,400 number laid out in the deal after 120 days, even with the coronavirus going on. That's a good sign. I was worried that this was going to get held up, actually. The U.S. says it was the Islamic State that carried out an attack on a hospital outside of Kabul. 2 children were killed in the attack, and Doctors Without Borders operated at that hospital. The government in Afghanistan does dispute this and claim it was the Taliban. The Taliban did carry out a suicide bombing attack against an Afghan government intel building, killing 7 soldiers. The U.S. Pacific Fleet announces that it's launching some aggressive submarine maneuvers against China. In the Middle East, an Israeli airstrike killed at least 7 Shia militants near the Iraq-Syria border. We've seen in the past that these airstrikes start to inflame tensions in the region, specifically between U.S. soldiers and Shia militias, and it's led to more serious attacks between the two groups. So let's hope that this dies out. The Washington Post is reporting that Israel carried out a cyber attack against an Iranian port. Iran reports that the cyber attack wasn't successful, and the Washington Post says it definitely disrupted logistical problems and traffic at the port. Gareth Porter has a new article out that you should definitely check out at the Gray Zone, reprinted at antiwar.com, where Gareth explains how the claims that Iran backed al-Qaeda after 9/11 are extremely dubious, and explains how Iran essentially was able to arrest some al-Qaeda members as they fled Afghanistan after 9/11. However, they were meant to be used as negotiating chips with the U.S. And, it's not like the U.S. put the al-Qaeda members there, or Iran put the al-Qaeda members in some kind of facility to plot against the United States. So, we've all heard this rumor before. If you need it debunked, I'll have a link in the show notes from Gareth Porter's most recent article. The U.S. is threatening Iran for shipping oil to Venezuela. I'm not sure what action the U.S. would actually look at taking, but Iran has already appealed to the UN to stop the U.S. from doing anything. The Pentagon has awarded Boeing $2.6 billion in contracts to sell missiles to Saudi Arabia. As I was talking about in the start of the show, probably should have had this story ordered way up with the rest of the Pompeo stuff, but is this really something that needs to be going on right now in the middle of the pandemic? And is this something that we want to be doing, knowing these bombs are likely going to be used by Saudi Arabia to kill children in Yemen? Rockets are reported to have landed near the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. This is the first time it's happened in a few weeks. And again, talking before about the Israeli airstrikes against the Shia militias in Syria, these are the kind of things that lead to retaliation. And, it may or may not have been Shia militias. It could have been, an ISIS cell or some other kind of group in Iraq that doesn't want American presence there, tried to carry out, hit the U.S. Embassy with some kind of mortar fire. Doesn't actually hit the building, doesn't cause any casualties, but it provokes the, one reaction from the Americans to go hit some Shia militia target or something like that. Just a few updates from Libya before I wrap up here. It's reported that leader of the Libyan National Army, Khalifa Haftar, fired a few missiles at the capital city of Tripoli and ended up hitting a hospital. At least 14 people were injured in that attack. And then the government of national accord, this is, quote, the internationally recognized government of Libya, although I think that's a pretty favorable claim to get them. But internationally, they're backed by Turkey, and they control the capital city and a few more cities along Libya's western coast. But they're continuing to push an offensive against Haftar's forces and have now retaken a key airbase again along the western coast. More fighting going on in Libya, so many other places around the Middle East. Again, as you know, in the United States, it's absolutely absurd to go to the grocery store without a mask. In a place like Yemen and Saudi Arabia, the U.S. continues to sell them bombs to continue a war effort that's impoverishing and killing so many. All right, that does it for the show today. Make sure you share the show, libertarianinstitute.org. Find me on social media at KYAAALE on Twitter. There's a private Facebook group called Foreign Policy Focus. Just search that up. If you're a real person, I'll let you into the group. Donate to the show at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Thanks, everyone.